Now that you have a good understanding of how Xert quantifies your training, we can transition into the bulk of today's content, which is centered on using Xert to help you improve. And to do this, I'm going to cover a couple key concepts that Xert uses to help you improve. I call them the 3 Ps. We have progressive overload, periodization, and polarization. Starting off with progressive overload, a simple way to explain the concept of progressive overload is that in order for you to increase your fitness, you need to do more than what you have been doing. And this isn't something that's unique to Xert or to cycling. It's a universal rule of fitness. If you want to be stronger in the gym, if you want to be a better runner, if you want to be a better cyclist, you need to push your body outside of its comfort zone. That's how you get stronger. And within the Xert software, we measure and we actually pace your progressive overload through a metric that we call improvement rate, abbreviated as IR. To help you understand this concept of progressive overload, I've created a quick little diagram in this bottom left corner. On the vertical axis, we're looking at your training load, or the number of stars in your profile. And on the horizontal axis, we're looking at time in weeks or months. We'll say that this dashed line represents today, and we'll have an example athlete who, say, rides 5 hours per week every single week. As we look at their training load over time, we see no change. They're going to continue to ride their 5 hours per week every single week, and so that we would expect that they neither gain fitness nor lose fitness. They're going to simply maintain. If this athlete wants to get stronger, maybe they add in 1 extra hour per week of training. And now, based on this blue line, you can see that they're going to slowly build their training load. They're going to slowly get more stars in their profile. And we would expect that as you get more stars in your profile, we know that you're going to become more fit. If we take this to the extreme and suddenly ask this athlete to ride 12 hours per week instead of 5 hours per week, you'll see that we would expect their training load to increase at a much faster rate. You can see this red line goes up much faster than the blue line. And so what I want you to start understanding is this relationship between how much you would like to improve and how much training it will take to meet that improvement. I'm going to keep that graph on the right-hand side just as a reference as I walk you through some of the different improvement rate settings in Xert. I'll start by listing the various improvement rate settings available in the software. The names themselves aren't super helpful alone, so to help you to help put them in context, I've created an example of the amount of time it would take an athlete to go from, say, a 2-star status to 3-star status. Starting with our maintenance athlete who rides their 5 hours per week, we would expect that they will never reach that 3rd training star. Why? Because they don't have a positive improvement rate. They're just maintaining their current level of fitness. At the slow improvement rate, so this blue line, it's going to take them a while to get that 3rd star, but they will get it. You can see in this example it would take 25 weeks or roughly half a year. And if we look at the extreme 2 improvement rate, we would actually expect that they could go from 2-star up to 3-star status in less than a month. It's a very, very high improvement rate. That's why we call it extreme. But the number chasing stars and the number of stars that you have in your profile isn't the only thing to consider when you're selecting an improvement rate. I also want you to be aware of, say, the total training time required and the recovery demands of a selected improvement rate. So to factor those in, I'll start once again with our maintenance athlete. We'll say that once again, they're continuing to ride their 5 hours per week every week. And we would expect that they have very little to no recovery demands. Their body is very used to those 5 hours per week, and so they might not feel that they ever need to take a recovery week. Their body is just so used to it. At the slow improvement rate, so it's going to take them half a year to get that 3rd star, but now we're only asking them to train an extra half hour per week. And this isn't a huge increase, and so the recovery demands might still be rather minimal. they might not find that they need to take a recovery week. If we compare this to, once again, the extreme 2 improvement rate, if they can follow this improvement rate, they'll gain that 3rd star in less than a month, but it's going to require 11.5 hours of weekly training time. And they're also going to have a very high demand for recovery because they're pushing their body so far beyond its comfort zone. So what I want you to take home from this chart as a whole is that as you increase your improvement rate, you're going to increase your training load and your fitness at a faster rate, but it's going to require more training time, and you also need to be more aware of the recovery demands. So for example, those of you on a slow or a moderate improvement rate might not feel that you need to take a recovery week every couple of weeks because the improvement rate is relatively low. However, those of you that are on an aggressive or an extreme improvement rate might find that that's only sustainable for 1 or 2 weeks, and then you need to take a recovery week. And this leads me very nicely into my next point, that your improvement rate isn't something that you set and forget in Xert. It's not set in stone. In fact, we want you to change your improvement rate. You can change it at any point in time. You can change it on a weekend, in the middle of a week, halfway through your training program. It's designed to be changed often. And so sometimes where you may want to consider changing your improvement rate might be due to time constraints. Maybe you have more or less time available to train. Another example of when you would want to change your improvement rate could be a recovery week, or if you're tapering and trying to freshen up for an event, you may want to reduce your improvement rate and allow yourself to recover. When you factor all this together, what I really want you to understand is that as you progress through the course of a season with Xert, your improvement rate is going to change quite often. And so I just have a quick little representative diagram here. Let's say that this is an example season for our athlete. Over the winter months, they might find that the moderate improvement rate suits their training time and their availability up until the outdoor season begins. And when the outdoor season begins, they might have much more time to ride, and they enjoy riding outside. So they might have an aggressive or an extreme improvement rate. However, they might find that that makes them quite tired, and so after a couple weeks, they may need a recovery week. After the recovery week, they might switch it back to, say, a moderate improvement rate. And at some point in the season, you might find that you're maxed out on your available hours for weekly training time. And so from there on, you can set your improvement rate to maintenance, and you'll continue riding at whatever the maximum amount of training time that you have is. So what I really want you to understand is that you can change your improvement rate, and you should change your improvement rate as circumstances change for you. And this is an important role that you have in your training with Xert. So what I want to do now is take us over to the software, and I'll show you where you can change your improvement rate. In this short demonstration, I want to show you some of the metrics that are related to improvement rate in Xert, as well as showing you how you can change your improvement rate and its influence on the recommended workouts. In the first video of the Mastering Xert series, we briefly talked about period statistics, as well as the XPMC, which shows your threshold power and breakthroughs that you got over a given period of time. To make things a little bit easier to see here, I'm going to click and disable the threshold power and form lines. And what we're left with on the XPMC is now a series of purple bars, which represent the days on which you did activities and how much XSS was accumulated on those rides. We're also left with this solid black line, which is labeled as your training load, or essentially how many stars you have in your profile. I'm going to relate this now up to our period statistics, and you'll actually notice that we track your training load in the period statistics section. And we calculate something known as ramp rate. We use the term ramp rate to show how your training load has changed on average each week in your historical data. So for this athlete's year-to-date data, which starts at the beginning of the year and goes till now, which is about middle of November, you'll see that overall they had a ramp rate of close to 0. But what's cool about this is you can actually click and drag over parts of your data, and the period statistics will update. And so I can see for this athlete, from basically the start of the year to the end of February, they had a ramp rate of about 3.4 training load per week. And so you can use this to perhaps see how you've historically built your training load over, say, winter or in the spring months, and use that information to help select an improvement rate in the future. What I want to do now is take us to the training tab, and we're going to spend more time talking about the Adaptive Training Advisor in the last section of this, but I want to quickly point out that right now, based on the current selections, this athlete has a 67 XSS surplus. But as we head to change their improvement rate, which is found via this goals button on the right-hand side, this will open up the goals and settings dialog box. From here, you can change your athlete type and improvement rate. And note that those of you on a target event will also be able to change your improvement rate, as well as those of you on the 30-day challenge. You can change your improvement rate here. But I'm going to use the continuous improvement since this is the default option and what a lot of our users are typically using. What you'll see at the bottom of this dialog page represents your threshold power, your athlete type power, which for a puncher, which is this athlete, is their 4 minutes watts per kilo, as well as their training load from 6 weeks ago. Then in the current column, you'll see how much training time is needed currently with the selected improvement rate, as well as how their threshold power, athlete type power, and their training load has changed in the past 6 weeks. And lastly, you'll see what the data is expected to look like 6 weeks from now based on this improvement rate. As I've mentioned a couple of times already today, with a maintenance improvement rate, we would expect that this athlete will not change their weekly training time. We would expect no changes in their fitness signature. They're not going to get more fit. They won't really lose fitness. They're just going to maintain. But as I change this from, say, maintenance, if I click on this and change it up to slow improvement rate, and I wait just a second for things to recalculate, now it's showing me that on the slow improvement rate, I'll need to train about 6 hours per week, and that if I look at my data 6 weeks from now, I'll see a slight increase in how much time I need to train. I'll see a slight increase in my threshold power, a very, very slight increase in my 4-minute watts per kilo, and a slight increase in the athlete's training load. If I were to, say, maximize this out for our athlete here and select an Extreme 2 improvement rate, what you'll see now is the weekly time needed to sustain this improvement rate is now 11.6 hours, and that grows to 23.3 hours in 6 weeks. But you'll also notice that the threshold power is expected to go up by quite a significant amount. The athlete type power is expected to go up, and a huge increase in training load as well. So keep in mind, as I've mentioned before, that as you increase the improvement rate, you're going to need to spend more time training, but we would expect that your threshold power and your fitness is going to go up at a faster rate. Now, if you can recall what that athlete's training surplus was, 67 XSS surplus, I'm going to change this to moderate 2, and then I'm going to click the Update Advice. And what we're actually going to see is our page is going to recalculate the current deficit. And you'll see now, after changing the improvement rate, the Adaptive Training Advisor is going to immediately update and take into consideration the newly selected improvement rate. So hopefully this makes sense and you have a good sense of how you can change your improvement rate. Let's continue on with the presentation. The second key concept that I want to discuss in this section of today's video is training periodization. Periodization simply refers to the changing focus of your training as you progress through different phases of a training program. For example, those of you that are using Xert to train for a particular target event will experience periodization as you progress from the base to the build, peak, and taper phases of the adaptive training program, all in preparation for that target event. Those of you that are on either continuous improvement or the 30-day challenge won't receive any periodization. Instead, those program types are specifically focused on your selected athlete type. To help you understand how Xert periodizes your training in preparation for a target event date, I'm going to walk you through a screenshot that I pulled from our support documents. And what this is showing us is the breakdown of the weekly training for an athlete type of puncheur who has a target event date of May 1st. As this athlete starts their training program 120 days before their target event date, they'll find themselves in the base phase, which lasts approximately 6.5 weeks. Now, the goal of the base phase is really to build up that low intensity system. So in the base phase, the focus of recommended workouts will be endurance. So you'll see plenty of workouts recommended with blue or green intervals. The idea here is that you're starting to build up that low intensity system. After the base phase, the athlete will find themselves in the build phase, which lasts another 6.5 weeks. Now, the goal of the build phase is to start introducing the athlete to high intensity. You want to start working on that high intensity system. And as this athlete progresses through the build phase, the workouts will start still with relatively longer focus durations. For example, an endurance focus or a climber focus. And as they continue progressing through those 6.5 weeks, the weekly training focus might decrease and it'll become a little bit shorter. So halfway through this through the build phase, we can see that this athlete is going to be doing perhaps row-lure workouts like the one on screen. And by the end of the build phase, this athlete will find themselves being recommended workouts that have a focus that is similar to their athlete type. For example, a breakaway specialist recommended workout. In the peak phase, which lasts about 3 weeks, the goal is to perform highly specialized training at your selected athlete type. And so the types of workouts that will be recommended during that 3-week peak phase will be workouts that have a focus that is nearly identical to your selected athlete type. The idea is if you want to, for example, for this athlete, if they want to work on their 4-minute power to be ready for their event, then Xert will recommend workouts that have nearly a 4-minute focus. It helps them really prepare for the demands of their event. Lastly, about a week before your target event date, you'll enter the taper phase. Like I said, it lasts about 1 week, and the goal of the taper phase is to reduce the volume that you're doing. So this would be an example where you would want to reduce the improvement rate, but you want to maintain the intensity or maintain the focus of your training. And so during the taper phase or taper week, you might find workouts, some of our opener workouts recommended during that taper phase. The idea is that they still have intensity to keep you primed and ready to go on that on your event day, but they're not overwhelmingly long. They're designed to not leave you fatigued before your target event date. So to re-summarize this, what I want you to understand about training periodization with Xert is that as you progress from the base phase all the way through the peak and taper phases, is that the focus of your training is going to change. It's going to start at a very long focus like endurance, and as you get closer and closer to your target event date, the focus of your training will draw nearer and nearer to your selected athlete type. What I want to do now is jump into the software and show you the influence that changing your athlete type has on your training periodization. In this demonstration, I want to show the role that your athlete type has in periodizing your training for a target event date. So to start off with, I'm going to go to our Goals and Settings tab again. And you can see that we are in the target event program type, that we have a target event date for early in 2022. And here I'm going to select, say, a road sprinter athlete type for that target event date. I'm going to leave the improvement rate as slow for all these demonstrations. As I click Update Advice and let Xert recalculate the training recommendations based on those updated selections, I'm going to scroll down on the Training tab down to the Adaptive Training Program. What I really like about this little feature or widget is that you can click and drag this white bar and see how your training is going to look in the future as you progress through your training program. As I mentioned early in the base phase, the goal of your training is going to be to accumulate that low XSS. And so you'll see endurance focus workouts recommended. And as you progress through that base phase, you're still seeing endurance focused workouts. But as you enter into the build phase for a road sprinter, I want you to notice how the weekly focus changes as this athlete progresses through the build phase. So you can see we start at the 20-minute power, we work our way down to 10-minute power, to 6-minute power, 4, 3, and by the time that this road sprinter arrives in the peak training phase, their weekly focus is going to be centered on road sprinter. That's their athlete type. And as they continue progressing through the peak phase, they're going to continue with a weekly focus that's equal to their athlete type. So they progress from that endurance focus all the way down to their 2-minute power, which is their athlete type. Now I want to contrast this to, say, a athlete type that has a longer focus duration. So let's say a climber now. Instead of a road sprinter, we're going to select a climber athlete type. And we're going to leave the same target event date, the same improvement rate. And we're going to update. We'll wait a second or so for Xert to recalculate the training advice. And we're going to look at the adaptive training program again. Unsurprisingly, in the base phase, both athletes, the road sprinter and the GC specialist, are going to be recommended endurance workouts. And as I click and drag through the base phase, you'll see that this athlete this climber now, is still being recommended endurance workouts. Where you'll really start to see the difference between these two athletes is as I click and drag through the build phase, I want you to take a look at the weekly focus duration. You'll see it's 20-minute power, it's still 20-minute power, still 20-minute power, down to 10-minute power, and by the time that this athlete reaches the peak phase, they're focusing on their 10-minute power. You don't see 6-minute power or 4 or 3-minute power like the road sprinters do, because this athlete has selected an athlete type, which is their 10-minute power. So hopefully what this demonstration illustrates is how the adaptive training program is going to adapt the weekly focus targets for you, specifically based on the athlete type that you have selected. Hopefully this makes sense. Let's jump back into the presentation and we'll cover the last point of this section. The last concept that I want to talk about in this section is training polarization. Now, many of you may be familiar with the term polarization as it's been made quite popular by researcher Dr. Stephen Seiler. In his investigations into elite level athletes, he's discovered that they typically train about 80% of the time at relatively low intensities and 20% of the time at relatively high intensities, with very little time spent in the middle. This would mean very little time spent around threshold or at sweet spot intensities. Although Xert doesn't follow a strict 80%, 20% approach, the math behind Xert suggests that you should train polarized. And the polarization in Xert is actually accomplished through the recommended workouts. You'll see as you begin using Xert more and more that the recommended workouts will be either low intensity endurance focused workouts or high intensity workouts. And that whether you're recommended low or high intensity is actually accomplished via your training status in Xert. For example, when your training status is green or blue, Xert is telling you that your energy systems, all three of them, your threshold power system, your high intensity energy, and your peak power systems, are all fresh and that you can do high intensity workouts. Many times after doing a high intensity workout, your training status might drop to too tired, or you might have yellow stars. With yellow stars, Xert is telling you that your threshold power system is still good to work out, but that your high intensity energy and peak power systems are too tired to train. In this case, you'll see low intensity endurance workouts recommended. When you reach a training status of red or very tired, Xert is telling you that your threshold power, high intensity energy, and peak power systems are too tired to train. When you see red in your profile, you should consider it as a rest day. If you do want to ride that day, you'll be recommended a very, very low intensity active recovery ride. What I want to do now is take you into Xert in the fitness planner and show you a little bit about how Xert can help polarize your training. In this short demonstration, I want to use the Xert fitness planner to show you how Xert can help you polarize your training via your training status. Scrolling down here into the fitness planner, you'll see that we're working with an approximately 2-star training load athlete, and that for today they have two blue stars. So if we look at the recommended workout for this athlete today, Xert is saying they're fresh, and so they can do high intensity workouts, and you'll see a variety of high intensity workouts listed here. What's also pretty neat is that Xert is going to look at the difficulty rating of workouts as well. So for our 2-star athlete here, they're going to be recommended workouts that are approximately 2 diamond difficulty. Let's say that our athlete is going to do the smart, say it ain't so hour-long workout. After doing that workout, Xert is calculating that they're going to be tired, or their training status is going to drop to yellow for the next 2 days. So what does this mean? Well, if we click and look at the recommended workouts for this athlete, now you'll see that yellow status, and so Xert is going to recommend endurance focus workouts, workouts that have a lot of green or blue intervals. You're not going to see high intensity workouts recommended with a yellow training status. And so if this athlete is going to do the feel like making bike workout on that Tuesday, you'll see that it doesn't impact how long it takes for them to return to blue status, since all of the XSS here is low intensity. And so they can continue to do endurance workouts while they're yellow. Now when their training status switches back to blue or fresh, Xert is saying, okay, they're ready for high intensity workouts again. And in fact, you can see that once again, 2.0 diamond difficulty workouts are recommended for this athlete. Now, let's say that we have a crazy athlete who wants to do Ronestad workouts on back-to-back days. Let's say I'm going to click and drag the Ronestad workout from my favorite workouts on the right here. And if I do that Ronestad back-to-back days, what you'll see is that eventually I'll reach that red, very tired training status. This is Xert saying you need to take some rest. And what you'll notice on red status days is that Xert is only going to recommend active recovery workouts. But you can really treat those red days as being a day of rest. You don't necessarily need to ride. So hopefully this demonstration helps illustrate how Xert can help polarize your training by recommending either high intensity when you're blue or green stars, recommending endurance workouts when you are yellow status, and recommending active recovery or a rest day when you have reached red stars. Let's jump back into the presentation. We're going to summarize or re-summarize this longer section before we continue on to the last section of today's video. Before we get to the final part of today's Mastering Xert lesson, I wanted to quickly recap what we talked about in this section, since there was a lot of content that I shared with you. Remember, first of all, we talked about the concept of progressive overload and how Xert can help you manage this through your improvement rate. Secondly, we talked about training periodization. For those of you using Xert to train for a particular target event, I showed you how changing your athlete type will influence the types of workouts that are recommended to you as you progress from the base into the build, peak, and taper phases. And lastly, we talked about the concept of training polarization and how Xert can help you polarize your training through your training status. Now, let's jump ahead to the last section for today's video.